I would argue that the most serious threat to the United States is not someone hiding in a cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan, but our own fiscal irresponsibility.
What hit the economy first was a housing slump. Fears spread to Wall Street. Consumers tightened their purse strings.
The U.S. Federal Reserve cut its key interest rate by half a point.
The I word, inflation, is coming to the
Major
fore.
developments on the lending crisis in the U.S. Oil and gold prices are spiking.
Nuclear right here on our financial
and
market.
it's complicated because of where we are in the election cycle.
Huge disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street.
Who is David Walker and why should we care? He's the nation's top accountant, the Comptroller General of the United States. He's totaled up the government's income, liabilities, and future obligations and concluded that our current standard of living is unsustainable unless some drastic action is taken, and he's not alone.
We suffer from a fiscal cancer. It is growing within us, and if we do not treat it, it could have catastrophic consequences for our country.
How big is the federal debt?
I don't know.
I'm guessing quite a bit.
I know it's a heck of a lot more than it was probably 10 years ago.
Well, take a stab at it.
69 billion.
It's probably huge.
What if I told you it was $8.7 trillion?
That's pretty crazy. Shouldn't be that way.
$8.7 trillion. Just how much money is that? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the overall size of America's economy, what economists call the gross domestic product, or GDP. In February 2007, when our federal debt was $8.7 trillion, our GDP was around $13.5 trillion. That meant that our federal debt was about 64% of our GDP. This level of debt to GDP is not the real problem. It's where we're headed that matters. If you were to add up all of the federal government's unfunded promises for Medicare and Social Security, you would see that as of September 30, 2007, America had dug itself into a $53 trillion hole, and it's getting deeper by at least $2 to $3 trillion every year by doing nothing. Unfortunately, with increasing budget deficits and recent government bailouts, we're now digging even faster. America faces 4 serious deficits today. The first is a budget deficit. The second is a savings deficit. The third is a balance of payments deficit, of which the trade deficit is a subset. And the fourth and most serious of all is a leadership deficit.
Did you know millions of Americans live with debt they cannot control? That's why I developed this unique new program for managing your debt. It's called Don't Buy Stuff You Cannot Afford.
Oh, let me see that. If you don't have any money, you should not buy anything. Sounds interesting.
Sounds confusing.
I don't know, honey. This makes a lot of sense. There's a whole section here on how to buy expensive things using money you save.
Give me that. And where would you get this saved money?
When I say trade deficit, do you know what that means?
Deficit usually means something like disorder or something, so something is wrong with it. It's not good.
It's the money that the United States owes.
Is the trade deficit with other countries, maybe?
So if we have a trade deficit, we're importing more than we're exporting.
Okay, there it is.
In 2007, China had the largest trade surplus in the world. And who was dead last? the United States of America.
Yeah, a few years ago I wrote an article for Fortune on sort of the parable of Squandersville and Thriftsville, which was designed to simplify for people problems inherent in persistent and large trade imbalances. Economics tends to put people to sleep, and I thought maybe by creating a couple of islands with inhabitants of quite widely different activities that it might get across a point that otherwise they get lost on. The thrust is that if you own a lot of property, an island in this case, you can trade it off for the things that you eat and consume every day, and you can do that for a long time. But eventually you run out of property, and then you have to work a whole lot harder to provide your own needs, but also to pay back for the debt you've incurred. Short-term actions have long-term consequences that sometimes people don't think about in the short run.
If you're buying more than you're selling, which is what a trade deficit is, eventually your trading partners are going to own a lot of your wealth. When they are not buying your goods and services with this money, they will be looking for ways to invest it. Running large and persistent trade imbalances can be problematic, especially when a country has a low savings rate and its government needs to borrow more money every year to pay its bills.
When the federal government needs to borrow money,
yeah.
Do you know how they do that?
I'm under the assumption that everyone else borrows money from us, so...
Some people think that we can solve our financial problems by stopping fraud, waste, and abuse, or by canceling the Bush tax cuts, or by ending the war in Iraq. The truth is, we could do all three of these things, and we would not come close to solving our nation's fiscal challenges. No matter what you personally believe should be done to address our nation's deficits, the magnitude of our problem is much bigger than people understand. Let's assume for a moment that all earmarks and special interest pork barrel spending were eliminated. They only represent about 1% of our annual federal spending. What if all three Bush tax cuts expired in 2010? That would only address about 10% of our federal financial hole. And what about Iraq? Even if the war ended in 2009, the total estimated cost of the war over time is less than 3% of our total financial problem. What about taxes? We would have to raise federal tax burdens across the board, more than 2 times today's levels, to close the financing gap. Some politicians complain when any tax increases are mentioned. We're facing a more than doubling of federal taxes if we continue down our present path. Our country would need $53 trillion invested today, which is about $175,000 per person, to deliver on the government's obligations and promises. How much of this $53 trillion do we have? Zip.